Okay, folks, I'm here with Big Friend. Trying to explain to this little guy over here about Durham Peters, Chapter 1, Understanding Media. Um, so, early on in the chapter, Durham Peters states that Wittgenstein once said, in mathematics, everything is algorithm, nothing is meaning. He goes on to say that he could have said the same of media and of music and of most things that really matter. He states that a medium must not mean but be. So I kind of wanted to examine that statement a little bit because I think like what he's trying to convey here is that the medium is really like the conduit to convey meaning. But I don't know if that's necessarily true all the time. Right now, in one of my other classes, I'm actually writing a paper about meta narratives and their implication towards authorship and um, like the creative process and things like that, and how they can become these examinations of the creative process itself. So while the narrative could be considered the medium, I mean, in that instance anyway, it also is the meaning or the examination of the meaning. And I also just wanted to point out here that I like what John Durham Peters does as far as citations are concerned. And like in this particular instance, he just drops this Wittgenstein quotation in, but he doesn't explain who Wittgenstein is. He doesn't provide any sort of context beyond just Wittgenstein said this. And I noticed that throughout a lot of the reading with Durham Peters, he will just like make a statement and then drop a footnote and be like, yeah, this is from this book by this person, but never contextualize that within his text. And then there are other instances where he'll be like, I'm paraphrasing so and so, and then state it, or he'll give like these direct quotations, but he'll actually explain like who the philosopher or who the thinker was behind these sentiments. But I actually really like the way that he varies his citations within the work, and I just think it's like an interesting aesthetic that he uses. Okay, so while Peters briefly summarizes the work and importance of thinkers like Marshall McLuhan and Andre Leroy Gourhan, his shift to Harold Innis makes his first shift towards what is perhaps the most important exploration of the whole reading, and that's infrastructure. He states that Harold Innis was one of the first to insist that infrastructure should be at the heart of media theory. And this is pretty much the groundwork for all of, or not all of, but most of the claims that Durham Peters makes. And he really does think outside the usual realms of digital media and digital spaces, and he really contextualizes it in a way that grounds it in just kind of like everyday life and the things that we take for granted. Like he'll point to the tap that you get your water from, or like the sewer system. But to think about media that way, I think, is really kind of brilliant, and it's important and true, because behind all of these things, that we use every day, like our cell phones and the apps contained within them, there are these like infrastructures just laid within them. I think he says at some point later on that like blessed be the one who can see the circuitry in the compact disc. He might have been quoting someone there, but it's that kind of mentality that just like runs as an undercurrent through this whole reading. And I just think it's so true. It's like the things that we take for granted, like the code behind the apps. Durham Peters gets into this whole reflection on old media versus new media, or what he says is more accurately mass media versus digital media. And he states that new media can look a lot like older ancient media. Registers, indexes, the census, calendars, and catalogs have always been in the business of recording, transmitting, and processing culture, of managing subjects, objects, and data, of organizing time, space, and power. And again, this is just very true. And you could see the ways in which, like, old media, or what he would dub as mass media, is contained within, this digital context, right, big friend? Um, like, just think about the things he lists there: calendars, catalogs, indexes. I mean, like, these are all the things contained within our cell phones today, or like our computers, the digital spaces that we occupy all the time. There's that clock and calendar right at the bottom right hand corner of my Surface Pro right now. So it is like really interesting to think in like the ways that these ancient medias are just rolled into all of the new ways in which we engage with it. He also says that we should never talk as if media did not exist before 1900 or 1800. He says that all complex societies have media in as much as they use materials to manage time, space, and power. And I mean, that's obviously true. We do use media in order to manage time, space, and power. And again, like, we got to go back to our cell phone, which is really, like, basically our pocket-sized overlords these days. And that's just how we manage our daily lives. Like, I would be lost without my daily reminders, without my calendar. And that kind of makes me think about the ways in which these digital spaces kind of like change the very ways that we think and operate within the real world. He discusses Kittler a little bit and says that, I think quoting Kittler here, as if to defy centuries of European opinion, he did not think that the great thing about Greece was its drama, ethics, or politics. It was its media system, consisting of combined letters, numbers, and tomes. So this is like a thought that he really fleshes out, like that the Greek alphabet was really, like ancient Greece's greatest contribution to the world, basically. And he goes on to get into this whole discussion of Archytas versus Plato and which had greater merit. And it's really this like whole discussion of I guess the merit of ideas versus tangible things. Like he lists some of Archytas' contributions as being an understanding of percussion and the inventor of the catapult and things like that, and how those very tangible real life applications and contributions are in fact greater than like the ideas that Plato gets lauded for still to this day. As far as that argument is concerned, I don't know if I entirely buy it. I think that Plato definitely informed rhetoric in ways that are still being used today, and I do think that ideas matter. Another thing that I've been thinking about recently is like the ways in which ideas take on a life of their own once they're breathed into existence. Something else I'm like fleshing out in that whole meta-narratives paper. So I don't know if I buy that entirely, but I definitely do agree with the notion that the Greek alphabet was the main contribution, or like the most important contribution ancient Greece made. Because if you just think about it, all the other things, the drama, the ideas, like Plato's speeches that were recorded and are still being read today, never would have been without the alphabet. So again, it gets into that whole question as to like what good are those ideas if they cannot be conveyed throughout time and throughout generations. And they wouldn't have been able to without the Greek alphabet. So Durham Peters goes on to coin the term infrastructuralism, and he explains that its fascination is for the basic, the boring, the mundane, and all the mischievous work done behind the scenes. So it's kind of like getting back into what we were talking about before with like the circuitry of the compact disc, or like the code behind the apps. He says that forgetting seems to be a key part of the way infrastructures work, and then points out that Lee Starr noted that they are often mundane to the point of boredom. And I mean, that's definitely true when you think about just like infrastructure in general. Like, it's meant to not be thought about, it's meant to be taken for granted. Um, like, how often do you think about the sewer systems when you flush your toilet? You don't. Like, how often do you think about the water filtration system that your tap water passes through? You just don't. Or the roads that you drive on. It's the same for these digital applications, right? Like, you're sitting on Spotify and you're not thinking about the code that went into designing the app, the technology behind delivering the music to your headphones. Um, oh, and this is actually, yeah, where that circuitry in the compact disc comes from, which he actually attributed to Kittler. So let me just correct myself there. It wasn't Durham Peters, it was Kittler. Another interesting thing that he says is that ontology, whatever else it is usually just forgotten infrastructure, which I thought was a pretty interesting claim. I'm not really sure how to break that one down. It's something that I'm definitely going to be reflecting on for a little bit. And then lastly, with with chapter 1 here, he talks about the microbe effect, and it's basically this question that's posed. It's this question that's posed from Louis Pasteur's realization that microbes exist, and he poses the question, like, did microbes exist before Pasteur? And he states that Latour actually says that the answer should be, of course not. And he gets into the whole idea behind the knowledge of nature, being able to change nature and change the past. And I think this is just like a really, it's like a really cerebral thought, like, obviously the microbes always existed. We just didn't know that they were there, and we didn't know how to view them and access them and interact in any ways until Pasteur came along and figured it out. But if you think about that, before Pasteur figured it out, like, they didn't exist in our histories, in our biologies. Like, if we don't recognize something and there's no discourse on it, like, does it really exist? It's that whole age old, if the tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, right? He goes on in this line of thinking to talk about the ways in which new inventions do not release us from old troubles too. And I just wanted to touch on that really quick because I thought that it was also like a really deep thought here. Because if you think about it, like, yeah, all these advancements in technology have made our lives easier, in some ways, and they definitely provide like a level of convenience and luxury that we weren't accustomed to before they were here. Even just thinking in the portability of these things, like, you put your phone in your pocket and you go, and now you have a supercomputer, you have a Walkman, you have a camera, you have a calendar, reminder system, GPS. Like, all these things used to be separate things, and before they were separate things, they weren't things at all. But like, all of like the real problems that still plague humanity are there. People still live in poverty. People still deal with like horrendous acts of violence daily, and these things while they work towards solutions, never seem to really arrive at a true solution to these things. So that's my video on John Durham Peters' Marvelous Clouds Chapter 1. Thanks for tuning in. I hope that you have a better understanding now, big friend. We'll be right back with Chapter 7. Thanks.